Talk of social justice as the answer to the problems of racism in America is in the front of people's minds and our culture right now. But one well-known black pastor and scholar says it's often radically different from biblical justice. Mark Martin spoke with FaithWire.com's Dan Andros for more on what Dr. Vadi Bachman had to say.
Dan, an African-American professor and Christian, says that social justice and biblical justice aren't the same. Tell us about his comments he made on talk radio.
Yeah, that's right. It's Dr. Vadi Bachman, and he is a professor, former pastor, a theologian, wears a lot of hats, and he has been speaking out about the issue of social justice for a long time, and he describes at length and in detail, and you can check out his full interview over on FaithWire.com, but he talks about how social justice isn't exactly the same as biblical justice because there's a lot of political motivations behind the social justice movement. A lot of it is built on Marxist ideologies, and the solutions they seek end up being outside of the gospel.
Vadi Bachman says people are speaking two different languages in the racism debate. Elaborate on that.
Yeah, he talked about where the divide happens a lot of time is because you have two competing worldviews, and a lot of it stems from some of this social justice, which he says is built on a sort of a structural worldview where you look at things as institutions and structures and power structures and hierarchies. And so when those two groups of people see an incident like the George Floyd incident, one side automatically sees it as just confirmation of a racist structural system. Whereas the other sees it as an individual sin or an individual, wrongdoing by a person, and they seek to rectify it that way. And so one person's reacting to it saying, see, here's the system. And the other person saying, here's an individual doing poorly. Let's look at the stats and, the situation and everything else. And so that's how we end up having two different conversations because our starting points are very different.
Dan, he also coined the phrase ethnic Gnosticism. What's that?
Yeah, well, that is this idea, and I'm going to read it here so I don't mess it up, but it's this idea that people groups and ethnicities have the ability to possess a secret knowledge of motive, intent, and goals in specific situations. So basically, you experience things as part of a people group, and anyone outside of that people group, they don't understand it, and they can never understand it. And so, Bachman makes the distinction between that, and he says, as Christians, we have to understand that our knowledge comes from God, and that God is the source of all knowledge, and that scriptures are sufficient. But he sees a lot of this, what he calls ethnic Gnosticism, in some of the movements that are pushing solutions today.
Did Bachman address violent protests versus peaceful ones?
He didn't exactly. What he did do was kind of dive more into the differences we see between the two people, and that's what's driving it. Again, those differences between people who view things as more structural, more systemic, versus the individual behavior, and that's where he says is driving a lot of the tension that we see out there.
Let's talk big picture. What is his message for African Americans as a whole in all of this?
Yeah, well, he says that, he himself grew up in L.A. To a single mother who wasn't a Christian, who was a Buddhist. And so he's been on the wrong end of police misbehavior himself. So he understands the problem. But he says that, he's traveled around the world. He's actually teaching in Africa right now. And he says that black people are some of the strongest people that he's seen. He said they overcome slavery. They've overcome slavery in America as just case in point, an obvious one. And he was saying that in America, compared to the rest of the world, that black people are incredibly prosperous, bar none, he said. And his message is that you don't need white people's permission. You don't need them to do anything in order to achieve and live free in America.
All right, Dan Andros of FaithWire.com. Thanks for bringing us this story, Dan. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Also tonight on FaithWire, a look at the possibility of more violence in Seattle's occupied zone. We'll have that and more. You can find it on FaithWire.com's Faith versus Culture. It begins at 9:30 Eastern with Dan Andros and Dale Partridge. You can find that on the CBN News Channel.